Wherever you are, welcome to another of my takes on China, and this one is a follow-on. I recently wrote a script about influencers who influence, and I mentioned the 4 new channels that Guangdong is promoting to get more real news about China out into the real world. And I thought it would be good to see if we can get some real stories to offset the made-up stories by others like the BBC and CNN, who simply want to come up with new ways but are really just rehashing old, in some cases 70-year-old stories to make China look bad. I've often said it's hard to hide the truth forever, but it's very easy to paper over the truth with a covering of lies. And that's what's being done in Western media. What China is trying to do now is different. It's not trying to refute lies. It's simply shining a light on them by producing truth. It's time to tell the realities of what China is really doing, rather than trying to refute stories of what others say China is doing. First of all, the big thing I'm noticing is that there's a great deal more confidence in China and among Chinese people. I've just returned from 2 months of traveling through China, and every day I met someone who would ask me what I'm doing, where I'm going, and so on. But invariably they'd also ask, is China good? And I'd reply, 非常好. Very, very good. China is most definitely opening up to the world. I see it every day, but others aren't seeing it so clearly. Eventually they will, though. What the Western world isn't noticing, or more appropriately, what the Western world isn't being told, is creeping up on them and appearing like a phantom out of nowhere. But it isn't coming from nowhere. It's already here. Journalists, politicians, and a huge number of people who should be paying attention are simply not paying attention. Wang Yi, for example, was in Europe recently, confidently telling Europeans to stop looking through an American lens. Now, this used to be rare. Chinese diplomats often speak in language that is, well, let's say, diplomatic. This is now happening on a much more regular basis, and Western diplomats don't like it. They've long been more confrontational, but the US has now lost all forms of diplomacy long ago. China has a more refined diplomacy and is likely to continue, but it's certainly increased its level of confidence. This is not a surprise, given what's been happening recently. Open up the State Council Information Office website. That's english.scio.gov.cn/, and you'll see Xi Jinping recently traveled to Vietnam, Cambodia, Malaysia, Russia, and Kazakhstan, where he met with the leaders of all 5 Eurasian Economic Union countries, not for the first time either. In Russia, he met with Serbia's president, Myanmar's leader, Cuba's president. When he's home, he recently met with the New Zealand Prime Minister, the Ecuadorian Prime Minister, the Senegalese Prime Minister, and many more, all while certain anti-China bloggers with large audiences were telling those audiences that he's mysteriously disappeared. How can they be so wrong? Open up the Chinese media and it's all happening here. None of these are reaching Western media consumers, and so many of those consumers believe the rhetoric that China is isolated. Nothing could be further from the truth. About 85% of the global population are doing great business with China. We didn't see much information in the Western media when China announced a tariff-free policy for the entire continent of Africa, excluding tiny Eswatini, which is still with US support, recognizing Taipei as the capital of China. In fact, if you search on Google, you'll only find African and Chinese media have covered this. Western media consumers aren't being told. Then they look with surprise as China reaches its growth targets and claim, well, it must be because China's numbers can't be trusted. All the while, it's not China, it's their own media that can't be trusted. It comes as no surprise either to those same media consumers that they're shocked and disbelieving when they learn that China is a global leader in so many different fields. Even ASPI, Australia's most famous anti-China think tank, has conceded that China leads in many categories. Their most recent report, released in August last year, shows China now leads in 57 of 64 technologies that they track. This is even higher than the report they presented a year before, where China led in 37 of 44 technologies that they were tracking. Who knew, for example, that those wonderful 360-degree images that were coming back from Mars through NASA were from a Chinese camera? The Insta360, made in Shenzhen by a company founded by a man from my adopted hometown of Zhongshan. In fact, if you read Western reports about this Insta360 camera on the Mars lander, you'll find no credit given to the manufacturers. There is a reference to a study that they did, but at no time do Western media admit that Chinese technology is helping NASA. Perhaps that's because it might be deemed illegal under the Wolf Amendment. But it gets worse for Western media consumers, who all think that anything made in China must be cheap and poor quality. Then they shake their heads in disbelief at things we know are true. Space exploration. A space station which has been functioning and growing for 4 years without a hitch, where foreign governments are sharing the knowledge that China is gaining. China sent the Zhurong rover to Mars. It wasn't mentioned in most Western media. They recently announced that in 2028 they'll not only send another mission to Mars, but they'll return with samples. Now imagine that. The USA finding that when they do eventually get to Mars, there's already a Chinese imprint there. But they wouldn't know about it because their media forgot to tell them. China went to the moon and back, returning with rocks that NASA wants to share, but their own laws in the US prevent them from doing so. We all know the EVs, the batteries, the solar panels, the sustainable energy. These are things that China has been quietly doing and sharing with the global South and getting recognition for, albeit begrudgingly in Western headlines that question, but at what cost? Who in the West knew that China has the world's best global navigational system, the Beidou system, which the Iranian government has just acquired and is rumored that the US military prefer over their own GPS system? I'm not kidding, I've linked that. Who knew that the Pentagon and the US military in general have obtained waivers against being blocked from using Huawei equipment, remembering that Huawei was banned in the US under a 2019 law? The Pentagon, knowing that it's better, more secure, and impossible to replicate in the USA, have obtained a waiver to allow them to continue using this Chinese system, which most experts assert has a much higher security standard and is more widely trusted and used than any other global system. NASA and even the US military, with their trillion-dollar budget, want more of China's technology. They want more rare earths, but they aren't getting them unless those are for peaceful purposes. China's making sure that the world has a chance of peace by restricting some of the most important components of weapon making. Many think that this was part of the tariff war. It wasn't. This was China making sure that for the short-term future and probably the next decade or so, the US won't be able to build weapons with China's minerals and then point them right back at China. The Trump administration isn't angry that China stood up to them in the so-called tariff war. They're angry because China won't back down on this, and they're accusing China of reneging on a deal that the US wanted, but China never promised them or will give them. And while we're on the topic of military, it wasn't a surprise to people in China, but all Western media consumers discovered recently that China's J-10 military jets knocked down 5 of India's fighter planes. It should not have been a surprise to Western media consumers at all. Expert analysts have been saying this for years. In fact, there is a 2024 Pentagon report which states this clearly. They're just not being told. The US may be a lot more destructive, but China's naval actions, such as a recent sail around the Australian coastline and the even more recent excursion beyond the US defensive island chain, shows that China's confidence militarily is at an all-time high. The US could do nothing. China broke no laws. It was, as the US will often say, exercising freedom of navigation rights. So it isn't just that people are learning the truth about China because of open visa policies. That's one thing. Thousands of vloggers flooding YouTube with more information about China is another. Millions of online visitors migrating to RedNote. It isn't the advances in science and technology, nor is it just the military prowess that's now being seen globally, or the fact that trade and relationships are growing with 85% of the world, and China is opening markets while the US is closing them. It's a combination of all of these things happening right under the noses of Western consumers who are not being told. And when they do find out, they can't believe it because they were never told about it. Western media consumers should ask themselves, what else are we not being told? Because there is a lot they don't know about. And it's going to be fun telling them. That's all from me today. Thank you very much for watching. Please don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. And I will see you next time. Bye for now.